She hid the real footage. That's what a little girl said, and that simple sentence was the start of a massive revelation. A furious millionaire decided to confront the editor. But why did she hide the original material? What was in that footage that no one wanted the public to see? Today, you're going to find out the whole truth. And get ready, because what was behind the cameras will shock you. Stay with me until the end. You won't believe what was revealed. The perfect life, the Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Hartwell's penthouse office on the 47th floor of the Chrysler Building. At 38, he commanded a business empire worth over $2 billion. Built from the technology company his father had started in their garage in Silicon Valley. Now Hartwell Industries dominated the artificial intelligence and cybersecurity markets across North America. Alexander loosened his Italian silk tie as he reviewed quarterly reports, the numbers dancing before his tired eyes. Success had come with a price: 16-hour workdays, constant travel, and a loneliness that luxury couldn't fill. That emptiness had begun to fade 6 months ago when Victoria Sterling entered his life at a charity gala in the Hamptons. Victoria, a stunning brunette with emerald eyes and a law degree from Harvard, seemed perfect. She understood his world, shared his ambitions, and never complained about his demanding schedule. Their whirlwind romance had captivated New York's social elite, and their engagement announcement in the New York Times Society pages had been the talk of Manhattan's upper echelon. "Mr. Hartwell?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Miss Sterling is here for your dinner appointment." "Send her in, Margaret." Victoria swept into the office wearing a designer black dress that hugged her curves perfectly. Her smile was radiant as she approached his desk, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. "Working late again, darling?" she purred, circling behind his chair to massage his shoulders. "You know what they say about all work and no play." Alexander leaned into her touch, feeling the tension ease from his muscles. "Just finishing up. The Tokyo deal requires my attention before tomorrow's board meeting." "Speaking of attention," Victoria said, producing a thick manila folder from her purse. James finished reviewing the prenuptial agreement. "There are just a few minor adjustments we discussed." Alexander frowned slightly. James Morrison was Victoria's lawyer, a shark in expensive suits who specialized in high-profile divorces. "Adjustments? I thought we'd finalized everything last week." "Nothing major, sweetheart. Just some clarifications about asset protection and business interests. You know how lawyers are. They want everything explicitly stated." Victoria's fingers traced the collar of his shirt. "James says it's standard procedure for marriages involving significant wealth." The penthouse felt suddenly cold, despite the efficient heating system. Alexander had built his fortune on attention to detail, and something about Victoria's casual dismissal of minor adjustments triggered his business instincts. However, looking into her beautiful eyes, he pushed the feeling aside. "I'll have my legal team review it tomorrow," he said, taking the folder. Victoria's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Of course, but remember, we're getting married in 3 days. The Waldorf Astoria has everything prepared, and our guests are flying in from around the world. We can't afford delays over paperwork." Alexander nodded, his mind already shifting to wedding logistics. The ceremony would host 400 guests, including business partners, politicians, and celebrities. The event had cost over $500,000, but money meant nothing when it came to celebrating their love. "You're right. Besides, what could possibly change between us?" Alexander stood and pulled Victoria into his arms. "I love you, and that's all that matters." Victoria melted against him, her perfume enveloping them both. "I love you too, Alex. More than you'll ever know." As they kissed, neither noticed the small figure watching from the hallway outside the office. 8-year-old Sophie Chun, daughter of Alexander's head of security, Marcus Chun, had been waiting for her father to finish his shift. She'd overheard enough adult conversations to understand that important papers were being discussed, and something about the beautiful lady's voice didn't sound right to her young ears. Sophie had always been unusually perceptive, a trait that both impressed and worried the adults in her life. She'd learned to read people's expressions and tone of voice from years of observing her father's work protecting important people. Right now, every instinct told her that the pretty lady wasn't being completely honest with Uncle Alex, as she called Alexander. The wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of Uncle Alex's life, but Sophie sensed something dark lurking beneath the surface of all the excitement and preparations. Chapter 2. Doubts and Discoveries. The morning sun cast long shadows across Central Park as Alexander jogged his usual 5-mile route, his breath visible in the crisp October air. The rhythmic pounding of his feet on the asphalt helped clear his mind, a necessary ritual before facing another day of wedding preparations and business meetings. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria, meeting with the florist at 10 a.m. Can't wait to be Mrs. Hartwell. Zoxo. Alexander smiled despite the nagging worry that had kept him awake most of the night. The prenuptial agreement sat on his nightstand, reviewed twice but still unsigned. His lawyer, Richard Blackstone, had been trying to reach him since early morning, leaving increasingly urgent voicemails. Mr. Hartwell, Marcus Chun's voice called from behind. The 45-year-old former Marine caught up easily, his own morning run interrupted by duty. Sir, Mr. Blackstone called the security office. He says it's urgent regarding legal documents. Alexander slowed his pace, wiping sweat from his forehead. Marcus had been his head of security for 8 years. Ever since Alexander's father had received death threats from a disgruntled former employee. Marcus was more than an employee, he'd become a trusted friend and confidant. Did he say what was wrong? Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew. No, sir, but he sounded concerned. Also, my daughter Sophie has been asking about you. She seems worried about something, though she won't tell me what. Alexander had grown fond of Sophie over the years. The little girl was remarkably intelligent and had an uncanny ability to sense when something was troubling him. Her mother had died in a car accident when Sophie was 4, and Marcus had raised her alone while maintaining his demanding job. Alexander had often helped with school events and holidays, creating an unofficial family bond. Is she okay? Not having nightmares again? Alexander's concern was genuine. Sophie occasionally suffered from anxiety, especially around big changes or stressful situations. No nightmares, but she's been unusually quiet. You know how she gets when she's processing something important. They reached the park's entrance where Alexander's driver waited with the black Bentley. Bring Sophie to the office after school today. Maybe some ice cream will help her open up. Marcus nodded, his weathered face creased with worry. Sir, may I speak freely? Always Marcus. I've been in security for 20 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts. Something feels off about the timing of all these last-minute changes. Wedding planning is stressful, but this feels different. Alexander studied his friend's face. Marcus had an impeccable record for threat assessment, having prevented 2 serious incidents in the past. If he sensed something wrong, it deserved attention. Keep your eyes open, Alexander said quietly. And Marcus, thank you for always watching out for me. The ride to the office was unusually quiet, giving Alexander time to think. His phone rang as they pulled up to the building. Richard Blackstone's office. Alexander, we need to talk immediately. Richard's voice was tense. There are significant changes to the prenuptial agreement that weren't discussed or authorized. Some of these modifications could potentially cost you hundreds of millions in various scenarios. Alexander's blood ran cold. What kind of changes? I'd rather discuss this in person. How soon can you get to my office? 20 minutes. As Alexander ended the call, he noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The woman he planned to marry in 48 hours had apparently lied to him about minor adjustments to their prenuptial agreement. The realization hit him like a physical blow, challenging everything he thought he knew about Victoria and their relationship. The Bentley pulled away from the curb, carrying Alexander toward what he suspected would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Behind them, Victoria Sterling watched from her own car, her phone pressed to her ear. "He's heading to his lawyer's office," she said into the device. "We may need to accelerate our timeline." Chapter 3. The Warning Signs Richard Blackstone's law office occupied an entire floor of a prestigious building overlooking Wall Street. The 60-year-old attorney had been Alexander's legal counsel for over a decade, handling everything from corporate acquisitions to personal matters. His reputation for meticulous attention to detail had saved Alexander millions in various deals. "Sit down, Alex," Richard said grimly, gesturing to the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. "What I'm about to show you isn't pleasant." Richard spread the modified prenuptial agreement across his desk, highlighting sections with a red pen. These changes weren't minor clarifications. They fundamentally alter the financial protections we'd built into the original document. Alexander leaned forward, studying the highlighted passages. Legal jargon filled the pages, but even he could understand the implications. She'd get half of everything, even the business. In the event of divorce, yes, but there's more. Richard flipped to another section. This clause gives her immediate access to liquid assets exceeding $50 million upon marriage. And this provision, he pointed to a dense paragraph, allows her to claim mental distress and emotional damages with no cap on the settlement amount. The office felt stifling despite the efficient air conditioning. Alexander loosened his tie, struggling to process the magnitude of Victoria's deception. "This essentially makes her a full partner in everything I own, regardless of her actual contribution to the marriage or business." "Exactly. And given her previous relationships, this pattern is concerning." Alexander looked up sharply. "Previous relationships?" Richard hesitated before opening another file. "I took the liberty of conducting a more thorough background investigation after reviewing these changes. Victoria Sterling has been engaged 3 times before, twice to wealthy men. Both previous engagements ended suddenly, and in both cases, she received substantial financial settlements despite never marrying." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Victoria had told him about one previous engagement to a doctor, describing it as a mutual decision that hadn't worked out. She'd never mentioned multiple engagements or financial settlements. "Are you suggesting she's a professional?" Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm suggesting she has a very specific pattern of behavior involving wealthy men and last-minute contract modifications. The men she's previously been involved with all report similar experiences: rushed engagements, pressure to sign revised agreements, and sudden relationship changes after financial documents were finalized." Alexander stood and walked to the window, watching the bustling street below. People hurried along sidewalks, focused on their own lives and problems, unaware that his entire world was crumbling 40 floors above them. Why didn't this come up in the original background check? She's careful and intelligent. The previous settlements were structured as mutual agreements rather than legal disputes, keeping them out of public records. It took extensive investigation to uncover the pattern. Alexander's phone buzzed with another text from Victoria, picking out final details for tomorrow's rehearsal dinner. "Can't wait to celebrate with you tonight. Love you," the casual affection in her message now felt calculated and manipulative. Alexander wondered how many of their intimate moments had been performance rather than genuine emotion. "What do you recommend?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "Don't sign the modified agreement. In fact, I'd strongly recommend postponing the wedding until we can sort this out properly." The thought of calling off the wedding sent panic through Alexander's chest. 400 guests, international travel arrangements, deposits on venues, catering, flowers, music. The logistical nightmare would be immense. More importantly, the public humiliation and media attention would be devastating for both personal and business reasons. "There has to be another option," Alexander said desperately. Richard's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Alex, you're talking about potentially losing half of a $2 billion empire to someone who may have been deceiving you from the beginning. No wedding is worth that risk." As Alexander grappled with the magnitude of his situation, neither man noticed the small figure pressed against the office door, listening intently. Sophie Chun had convinced her father to bring her along when Marcus came to check on security arrangements for the wedding. While Marcus met with building security downstairs, Sophie had wandered upstairs looking for Uncle Alex. What she'd overheard made her young heart race with worry and anger. The pretty lady was trying to steal Uncle Alex's money, just like the bad people in movies who pretended to love someone but really wanted to hurt them. Sophie knew she had to warn Uncle Alex, but adults didn't always listen to children, even when they were telling the truth. She'd need proof that grown-ups would believe, and she'd need to be very careful about how she got it. The 8-year-old pressed closer to the door, memorizing every word of the conversation inside. Chapter 4. A Child's Investigation. Sophie Chun sat in the back corner of her third-grade classroom, her mind racing while Mrs. Patterson explained multiplication tables. Numbers had always been easy for Sophie, too easy. While her classmates struggled with basic math, she was secretly reading detective novels hidden inside her textbooks. Today's lesson was interrupted by thoughts of Uncle Alex and the mean lady who wanted to steal his money. Sophie had learned enough from her father's work to understand that bad people often looked nice on the outside. They smiled and said sweet things while planning terrible things. During recess, while other children played on the swings and monkey bars, Sophie sat on a bench with her notebook, making a plan. She'd seen enough detective shows to know that solving crimes required evidence, and evidence meant finding proof that adults would believe. "Sophie, why aren't you playing?" asked her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, approaching with concern. "I'm thinking about something important," Sophie replied honestly. "My dad says thinking is just as important as playing." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "That's very wise. What are you thinking about?" Sophie considered how much to reveal. Adults always said children should tell them when something was wrong, but they also said not to worry about grown-up problems. This felt like both. If someone you love was going to make a big mistake, how would you help them see the truth? Sophie asked carefully. "That's a very mature question. I think the best way is to be honest and share what you know, even if it's difficult. People we love deserve the truth, don't they?" Sophie nodded, her resolve strengthening. After school, she would find a way to help Uncle Alex. That afternoon, Marcus picked Sophie up from school and drove to Alexander's office building. The 47-story glass tower housed Hartwell Industries headquarters, and Sophie had visited many times over the years. She knew the building's layout better than most adults realized. "Dad, can I go see Uncle Alex while you check the security cameras?" Sophie asked as they entered the lobby. Marcus hesitated. "He's had a difficult day, sweetheart. Maybe we should wait until..." "Please, I made him a drawing." Sophie held up a piece of paper covered in crayon hearts and flowers. It wasn't exactly a lie. She had made a drawing, though her real purpose was more complex. 5 minutes, Marcus agreed. "Then come straight to the security office." Sophie took the elevator to the 47th floor, her small hands gripping the drawing tightly. The executive offices were usually quiet in the late afternoon, with most employees gone for the day. Perfect for what she needed to do. Alexander's assistant had left, but his office door was open. Sophie could see him sitting at his desk. staring out the window with a sad expression that made her heart hurt. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "Sophie." Alexander's face brightened genuinely for the first time all day. "Come here, sweetheart. How was school?" Sophie ran to his desk and held up her drawing. "I made this for you. It's for good luck with your wedding." Alexander accepted the drawing, examining the colorful hearts and stick figures. "It's beautiful, thank you." "Uncle Alex, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Sophie climbed onto the chair across from his desk, her legs dangling several inches from the floor. "When grown-ups make promises, are they supposed to keep them?" "Yes, definitely. Promises are very important." "What if someone makes a promise but they're lying inside their heart?" Alexander studied Sophie's serious expression. Her questions often carried deeper meaning than their simple words suggested. "Why do you ask?" Sophie took a deep breath, remembering her father's lessons about being brave. "I heard the pretty lady talking on her phone yesterday when I was waiting for Dad. She was saying mean things about you." Alexander's attention sharpened. "What kind of mean things?" "She said you were easy to trick because you wanted to believe in love. She laughed about papers you had to sign." Sophie's voice dropped to a whisper. "She said once the wedding happened, she'd be rich and could find someone younger and more handsome." The words hit Alexander like ice water. "Sophie, are you absolutely sure about what you heard?" "I have good ears. Dad says I hear things other people miss." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want the mean lady to hurt you. You're the nicest person I know." Alexander came around the desk and knelt beside Sophie's chair, taking her small hands in his larger ones. "Can you tell me exactly where this happened and what time?" "Yesterday after school, in the parking garage downstairs." She was standing by her red car, talking really quietly. "But sound carries funny down there. Dad taught me that when he was showing me about acoustics and security." Alexander's mind raced. Yesterday afternoon, Victoria had claimed to be at the spa. The red car was her Ferrari, a gift he'd given her for her birthday. If Sophie had overheard such a conversation, it corroborated everything Richard had discovered about the prenuptial agreement changes. "Sophie, this is very important. Did she say anything else?" "She said something about timing and making sure you signed before you found out about." Sophie scrunched her face, trying to remember the exact words. "Before you found out about the others. She said once you were married, it wouldn't matter what you discovered later." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Alexander. Victoria wasn't just after his money, she was part of some larger scheme, possibly involving multiple victims. The others Sophie had heard about might refer to the previous wealthy men Richard had mentioned. "Uncle Alex, are you going to marry the mean lady?" Sophie's voice was very small. Alexander looked into the trusting eyes of the 8-year-old, who had potentially saved him from the biggest mistake of his life. "No, sweetheart. I'm not going to marry her." Sophie's face broke into a relieved smile. "Good. You deserve someone who loves you for real, not for your money." Chapter 5. Unraveling the Truth. The emergency meeting convened at Richard Blackstone's office at 7 p.m., 2 hours after Sophie's revelation. Besides Alexander and Richard, the gathering included Marcus Chen, private investigator, Elena Rodriguez, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic accountant who specialized in financial fraud cases. "In 18 hours, I'm supposed to marry a woman who may be part of an organized scheme to defraud wealthy men," Alexander said, his voice hoarse from stress. "I need to know everything about Victoria Sterling before I make any decisions." Elena Rodriguez, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, opened a laptop and connected it to the conference room's projection system. "Based on Sophie's information and our accelerated investigation, we've uncovered disturbing patterns." The screen displayed a timeline showing Victoria's movements over the past year. Victoria Sterling isn't her real name. She's actually Victoria Chen, no relation to your Marcus. Alina clarified quickly. She's been using various identities across multiple states. A series of photographs appeared showing Victoria with different hair colors and styles, but the same distinctive green eyes. She's been linked to at least 6 wealthy men over the past 5 years. Each relationship followed an identical pattern: whirlwind romance, quick engagement, last-minute prenuptial modifications, and either a lucrative breakup settlement or a brief marriage followed by divorce. Alexander studied the images, recognizing the woman he'd fallen in love with, but seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. How much has she stolen? Dr. Mitchell consulted her tablet. Conservative estimates place her take at over $50 million across all victims. She works with a team, the lawyer James Morrison, a private investigator who backgrounds her targets, and at least 2 other associates who help create false identities and documentation. What about the other men? Did any of them prosecute? That's part of their strategy, Richard explained. The settlements are structured to include non-disclosure agreements and non-prosecution clauses. The victims are essentially buying their silence along with their freedom. Marcus spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Sir, there's something else." Building security footage shows Victoria entering the parking garage yesterday at the time Sophie mentioned, but she didn't park in her assigned space. She deliberately chose a location with poor camera coverage. Alina clicked to the next slide. This suggests she was aware of surveillance and chose that spot specifically for a sensitive phone conversation. It also indicates she's more sophisticated than initially apparent. Alexander rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. So she deliberately positioned herself where she thought no one could overhear, but didn't account for an 8-year-old with exceptional hearing. Children are often invisible to criminals, Dr. Mitchell observed. Adults focused on avoiding. Other adults frequently overlook the presence and perceptiveness of children. The conference room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Alexander's phone, sitting on the table, buzzed with an incoming text from Victoria. "Can't sleep. Too excited about tomorrow. Love you more than words can say." The message, which 12 hours earlier would have made Alexander smile, now felt manipulative and calculated. Every expression of affection from the past 6 months was now suspect. "What are my options?" Alexander asked quietly. "Legally, you have several choices," Richard said. "You can simply not show up tomorrow, which creates public embarrassment, but prevents financial loss. You can confront her privately and call off the wedding. Or," he paused dramatically, "or we can turn the tables. Alina has contacts in law enforcement who've been tracking this organization. If we can get Victoria to incriminate herself, we might be able to stop her from victimizing anyone else." Alina leaned forward. "The FBI has been building a case against this group for 2 years. They've been waiting for the right opportunity to move. Your wedding could provide that opportunity." Alexander considered the options. The thought of publicly humiliating Victoria, regardless of her crimes, didn't sit well with him. But the idea of protecting future victims was compelling. "What would that involve?" "You'd go through with the wedding ceremony," Alina explained, "but we'd have recording devices and surveillance in place. During the reception, we'd create situations designed to get her to reveal information about the organization and previous victims. Once we have solid evidence, law enforcement would move in." Marcus frowned. "That puts Mr. Hartwell at significant risk. If this group realizes they're being investigated, they might become violent," Alina agreed. "But with proper security measures and law enforcement backup, the risk could be minimized." Alexander stood and walked to the window, watching the lights of Manhattan twinkle in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Victoria was probably finalizing plans for what she believed would be the biggest score of her criminal career. Other wealthy, lonely men might be receiving the same treatment he'd experienced: the carefully orchestrated romance, the whirlwind courtship, the gradual erosion of common sense. If I do this, what happens to the marriage legally? We'd have annulment papers prepared in advance, Richard said. Based on fraud and misrepresentation, the marriage would be voided within hours of the ceremony. Alexander turned back to face the group. And if I don't do this? Victoria disappears, probably with a substantial settlement to avoid prosecution, Elena said. She resurfaces somewhere else with a new identity and new targets. The cycle continues. As Alexander weighed his options, Sophie's words echoed in his mind. You deserve someone who loves you for real. The little girl had shown more courage and integrity than many adults he knew. Perhaps it was time for him to show the same qualities. Set it up, Alexander said firmly. But I want extra security on Sophie and Marcus. If this goes wrong, they can't become targets. Chapter 6. The Wedding Day Trap. The Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom was transformed into a winter wonderland of white roses, crystal chandeliers, and elegant ice sculptures. 400 guests had traveled from around the world to witness what New York society believed would be the wedding of the year. They had no idea they were about to witness the unraveling of a sophisticated criminal operation. Alexander stood in the groom's preparation room, adjusting his silver cufflinks with steady hands despite the chaos in his mind. The tuxedo was perfectly tailored, the boutonniere precisely positioned, and his appearance would give no hint of the elaborate deception about to unfold. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus entered, followed by Sophie wearing a beautiful blue dress and carrying a small bouquet of flowers. Sophie wanted to wish you luck before the ceremony, Marcus said quietly. Sophie approached Alexander with unusual solemnity. Uncle Alex, are you sure about your plan? Alexander knelt to Sophie's eye level. I'm sure, sweetheart. Sometimes good people have to do difficult things to protect others. Like when superheroes pretend to be bad guys to catch the real bad guys. Exactly like that. Sophie nodded gravely, then threw her arms around Alexander's neck. Be careful. You're the best uncle in the whole world, even if you're not really my uncle. The simple declaration nearly brought tears to Alexander's eyes. This 8-year-old child had shown him more genuine affection in their brief conversation than Victoria had in 6 months of elaborate romance. Mr. Hartwell, came Elena Rodriguez's voice through his nearly invisible earpiece. Audio check. Can you hear me clearly? Alexander touched his boutonniere, which concealed a sophisticated recording device. Crystal clear. All surveillance teams are in position. FBI agents are stationed throughout the ballroom, disguised as waitstaff and photographers. Detective Morrison will make the arrest signal when we have sufficient evidence. The plan was complex but thorough. Alexander would go through with the ceremony using vows he'd rewritten to be legally non-binding. During the reception, Elena's team would create opportunities for Victoria to reveal information about her criminal organization. Hidden cameras and microphones would capture everything for evidence. Another knock announced Richard Blackstone's arrival. How are you holding up? Terrified, Alexander admitted honestly. 6 hours ago, I thought I was marrying the love of my life. Now I'm helping law enforcement catch a professional criminal who's been manipulating me for months. The annulment papers are ready, Richard assured him. The moment we have what we need, this nightmare ends. Down the hall, Victoria Sterling was putting the finishing touches on her makeup, unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. She believed she was minutes away from the biggest score of her career, access to a fortune. That would set her up for life. Her phone buzzed with a text from James Morrison. Everything ready on our end. Execute phase 2 immediately after the ceremony. Victoria smiled at her reflection in the mirror. Phase 2 involved triggering Alexander's signature on several additional documents during the reception, using emotional manipulation and carefully timed distractions. By tomorrow morning, she'd have access to liquid assets exceeding $100 million. The wedding march began playing in the ballroom, signaling the start of the processional. Alexander took his position at the altar, flanked by Marcus as his best man and Sophie as the honorary flower girl. The assembled guests rose as the bridal party began their entrance. When Victoria appeared at the ballroom's entrance, Alexander had to admit she looked stunning. The designer wedding gown cost more than most people's annual salaries, and her radiant smile would have convinced anyone that she was a woman deeply in love. As she walked down the aisle, Victoria's eyes met Alexander's, and for a moment, he wondered if any part of her feelings had been genuine. The thought was quickly dismissed as he remembered the phone conversation Sophie had overheard and the evidence Elena had uncovered. The efficient Reverend Dr. James Patterson began the ceremony with traditional words about love, commitment, and trust. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander as he prepared to exchange vows with a woman who embodied the opposite of each virtue being celebrated. Do you, Victoria Sterling, take Alexander Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? Victoria's voice was clear and confident. I do. The words that should have brought Alexander joy instead filled him with sadness for what might have been if she'd been genuine. When his turn came, he spoke the carefully crafted vows that would protect him legally while appearing sincere to witnesses. I do, Alexander said, slipping the ring onto Victoria's finger and sealing what he knew would be the shortest marriage in New York society history. As they kissed to seal their union, Alexander could hear Elena's voice in his earpiece. Phase 1 complete. Let's catch some criminals. Chapter 7. The Reception Revelations. The reception was in full swing when Victoria made her first mistake. The champagne, flowing freely among the 400 guests, had loosened her tongue just enough to make her careless. She stood near the ice sculpture, speaking in hushed tones with James Morrison while FBI surveillance teams recorded every word through sophisticated directional microphones. The papers are in my purse, Victoria whispered to her fake lawyer. Get Alexander's signature on the asset transfer documents during the father-daughter dance. He'll be emotional and distracted. What about the Swiss account access? Morrison asked, his voice barely audible above the string quartet. Already arranged. Once he signs tonight, we'll have full access to the Cayman holdings by Monday morning. Alexander, dancing with Sophie to The Way You Look Tonight, heard every word through his earpiece. The 8-year-old in his arms had no idea she was part of an elaborate FBI operation, though she sensed the tension in his posture. Are you okay, Uncle Alex? Sophie asked quietly. Just thinking about how lucky I am to have friends like you and your dad, Alexander replied honestly. Across the ballroom, Elena Rodriguez was coordinating multiple surveillance teams while disguised as a wedding photographer. Alpha Team, did you get that conversation about the Swiss accounts? Copy that. We have Victoria Sterling admitting to financial fraud and conspiracy, came the response through her hidden microphone. The plan was working perfectly. Victoria's confidence had made her careless, and each conversation was providing more evidence of the criminal organization's scope and methods. As the father-daughter dance ended, Victoria approached Alexander with a radiant smile and a leather portfolio. Darling, I hate to interrupt the festivities, but James has some final paperwork that needs your signature tonight. Something about transferring some assets for tax purposes before the end of the quarter. Alexander pretended to study the documents while actually reading a text message from Elena. Keep her talking. We need more names and locations. These look complicated, Alexander said carefully. Maybe we should wait until after our honeymoon when I can review them properly with my accountant. Victoria's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. Alex, sweetie, the deadline is tomorrow. If we don't file these tonight, it could cost us millions in unnecessary taxes. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Alexander recognized the Same manipulation tactics Victoria had used throughout their relationship, creating artificial urgency to prevent careful consideration. "Of course," Alexander said, reaching for a pen. "I trust you completely." As Alexander pretended to sign the documents, Sophie appeared beside them carrying a plate of wedding cake. In a move that would have seemed accidental to any observer, she bumped into Victoria, causing her purse to spill open across the marble floor. Among the scattered contents, several cell phones, multiple credit cards with different names, and a small notebook filled with handwritten information became visible. Alexander quickly bent down to help collect the items, palming the notebook while pretending to be helpful. "I'm so sorry," Sophie exclaimed with perfect 8-year-old innocence. "I didn't see your purse there." "It's fine, sweetheart," Victoria said through gritted teeth, quickly gathering the phones and cards. But she didn't notice the missing notebook, now safely in Alexander's jacket pocket. Elena's voice crackled through Alexander's earpiece. "Beautiful work, Sophie. That notebook is exactly what we needed." The rest of the reception proceeded like a carefully choreographed dance. Victoria became increasingly agitated as she realized the notebook was missing, while Alexander played the role of blissful newlywed. Other members of Victoria's organization, identified through FBI surveillance, began showing signs of nervousness as they sensed something was wrong. At precisely 11:47 p.m., as the last dance was ending, Elena gave the signal. "All teams, move." In now. FBI agents throughout the ballroom dropped their disguises and began making arrests. Victoria's shock was genuine as Agent Sarah Chin Marcus's cousin, recruited specifically for this operation, approached with handcuffs. "Victoria Chun, also known as Victoria Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and extortion." "This is impossible," Victoria gasped, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Alex, what's happening?" Alexander removed his boutonniere and handed the recording device to Agent Chun. "I know about the prenuptial agreement changes, Victoria. I know about the other men you've defrauded. Most importantly, I know you never loved me." Victoria's green eyes filled with rage rather than tears. "You have no idea what you've done. This organization is bigger than you realize. We have connections that will what?" Alexander interrupted. "Threaten the safety of an 8-year-old girl who was brave enough to tell the truth? Intimidate federal agents? You've already told us about the Swiss accounts, the Cayman holdings, and your associates." As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she turned back to Alexander with venom in her voice. "You could have been happy. I could have made you happy." "No," Alexander said quietly. "You could have made me rich seem poorer, but you could never have made me happy. Happiness requires truth, and you're incapable of that." The ballroom, which an hour earlier had hosted one of New York's most elegant wedding receptions, now resembled a crime scene. Guests milled about in confusion while FBI agents collected evidence and took statements. Sophie found Alexander sitting alone at the head table, his bow tie undone and his jacket draped over the back of his chair. "Uncle Alex, are you sad?" Alexander pulled the little girl onto his lap. "I'm sad that someone I cared about wasn't who I thought she was. But I'm grateful to have friends who care enough about me to tell the truth, even when it's difficult. Will you be okay?" Alexander looked around the ballroom at the agents efficiently dismantling Victoria's criminal operation, at Marcus coordinating security, and at the handful of real friends who had stayed to support him through the aftermath. "Yes, sweetheart. I'll be more than okay. I'll be free." Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's penthouse as he sipped coffee and reviewed newspaper headlines on his tablet. Millionaire's wedding turns, FBI sting operation, dominated the front page of the New York Times, while the Post had gone with wedding crashers, FBI busts matrimonial fraud ring. The past week had been a whirlwind of FBI interviews, legal proceedings, and media attention. Alexander's role in bringing down Victoria's organization had made him a reluctant hero, though he preferred to think of himself simply as someone who'd been lucky enough to have good friends looking out for him. A knock at the door interrupted his morning routine. Sophie Chun entered carrying a bouquet of sunflowers and wearing a bright yellow dress that matched her cheerful disposition. "Good morning, Uncle Alex," she announced, presenting the flowers with a flourish. "Dad said I could visit before school because you seemed sad yesterday." Alexander accepted the sunflowers with genuine delight. "These are beautiful, Sophie. Thank you. Mom always said sunflowers were happy flowers because they follow the sun," Sophie explained, climbing onto the couch beside him. "I thought you needed some happy flowers." The mention of Sophie's mother, whom Alexander had never met but felt he knew through Marcus's stories, touched him deeply. "Your mom was very wise. Dad says the bad lady is going to jail for a long time." "Yes, she is. She and her friends won't be able to hurt anyone else." Sophie nodded gravely, then brightened. "Does that mean you can find a real love now? Like in the movies where the prince meets the princess after defeating the dragon?" Alexander laughed, the first genuine laughter he'd felt in weeks. "Maybe someday, sweetheart. But first I need to figure out how to be happy by myself." "You're not by yourself," Sophie protested. "You have me and Dad, and Mr. Richard, and Mrs. Margaret, and all the nice people who work for you. That's called a family, even if you're not related." The 8-year-old's simple wisdom struck Alexander with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on romantic love that he'd overlooked the genuine relationships already in his life. Sophie was right. He did have a family, one built on loyalty, trust, and mutual care rather than blood relations or legal documents. "You're absolutely right," Alexander said, hugging the little girl. "I do have a family." Marcus appeared in the doorway, dressed in his usual dark suit, but looking more relaxed than he had in months. "Sorry to interrupt, sir. The FBI called to update you on the investigation." "What did they find?" Victoria's notebook contained information on over 30 potential targets across the country. Her organization was much larger than initially suspected, with operations in 8 states. Your case was going to be their biggest score yet. Alexander shuddered at how close he'd come to losing everything. What about the previous victims? Many of them are cooperating with the investigation now that the non-disclosure agreements are void due to criminal fraud. Several are filing civil suits to recover their losses. Sophie looked confused by the adult conversation. "What's a civil suit?" "It's when people go to court to get their money back from bad people who stole it," Alexander explained. "Good," Sophie said firmly. "Stealing is wrong." "Indeed it is," Alexander agreed. "Now, shouldn't you be getting ready for school?" "Actually," Marcus said, "Sophie's teacher called this morning. The class is studying heroes and heroines, and they'd like Sophie to present about her role in stopping the criminals. Apparently, the stories made her quite famous among her classmates." Sophie blushed but looked pleased. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm an example of how children can help solve grown-up problems if they're brave and honest." "She's absolutely right," Alexander said. "You're the bravest person I know." After Sophie and Marcus left for school, Alexander returned to his coffee and contemplation. The past year had taught him valuable lessons about trust, intuition, and the difference between love and manipulation. Victoria had been skilled at mimicking affection, but Sophie's genuine care highlighted the stark difference between real and fake emotions. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the forensic accountant who'd helped uncover Victoria's fraud. "Alexander, I have some interesting news about your case," Dr. Mitchell said. "Victoria's organization has been operating for over a decade. You weren't just a target, you were going to be their retirement score. After stealing your assets, they planned to disappear completely." The realization that he'd been specifically chosen for such an elaborate scheme was both flattering and terrifying. How did they select me? Combination of factors: wealth, public visibility, and personal circumstances that suggested loneliness, and vulnerability to romantic manipulation. They'd been researching you for over 2 years before Victoria made contact. Alexander remembered the charity gala where he'd first met Victoria, how perfectly she'd seemed to understand his interests and ambitions. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every intimate moment had been calculated and performed. Dr. Mitchell, can I ask you something personal? Of course. How do you trust anyone after discovering something like this? How do you distinguish between genuine affection and skilled manipulation? Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. You look for consistency between words and actions over time. Manipulators are performers. They can maintain a facade for months, but authentic people show you who they are in small, unguarded moments. Real love doesn't pressure you or create artificial urgency. It doesn't try to change your fundamental protections or rush you into life-altering decisions. And children? Children are excellent lie detectors because they haven't learned to ignore their instincts yet. Sophie heard what her intuition told her to hear, that Victoria's tone didn't match her words. Adults often rationalize away those same warning signs. After ending the call, Alexander walked to his office windows and looked out over Manhattan. The city bustled with millions of people pursuing their own dreams and ambitions, most of them honest and genuine in their relationships. He thought about Sophie's suggestion that he needed to learn how to be happy by himself. Perhaps that was the key, building a life so fulfilling that he wouldn't be vulnerable to manipulation by those who promised to fill an emptiness that shouldn't exist in the first place. For the first time since the wedding that wasn't, Alexander felt genuinely optimistic about the future. Chapter 9: New Beginnings. 3 months after the wedding that became an FBI sting operation, Alexander sat in a small coffee shop in Greenwich Village, waiting for someone who might help him learn to trust again. The invitation had come through. Richard Blackstone, whose wife had insisted that Alexander meet her friend Emma Thompson, a children's librarian who had no idea who he was or what he was worth. "She's brilliant, kind, and completely unimpressed by wealth," Richard had explained. "Margaret thinks you two might get along, and honestly, what could it hurt to have coffee with someone who sees you as just Alex instead of Alexander Hartwell?" Billionaire? Emma arrived 5 minutes late, carrying a stack of children's books and wearing a blue sweater that brought out her warm brown eyes. She was pretty in an understated way, with laugh lines that suggested she smiled often and genuinely. "You must be Alex," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "I'm sorry I'm late." Story time ran long when the kids started asking complicated questions about why the caterpillar was so hungry. Alexander found himself genuinely curious about the answer. "What did you tell them?" "That sometimes being hungry isn't about food, it's about wanting to grow and change and become something beautiful," Emma smiled. "Though I suspect they were more interested in the pictures than my philosophical interpretations." Their conversation flowed naturally from children's literature to travel, favorite restaurants, and shared interests in hiking and classical music. Emma had traveled extensively through Europe after college, working in libraries and schools. She spoke 3 languages and had strong opinions about everything from urban planning to the proper way to make tea. Most importantly, she treated Alexander like a normal person. When he mentioned his work in technology, she asked intelligent questions about cybersecurity and artificial intelligence without seeming to calculate his net worth. She was clearly bright and well-educated, but she wore her intelligence comfortably rather than defensively. "Richard's wife says you recently went through a difficult breakup," Emma said gently as their coffee cups emptied. "That's pudding." "It mildly," Alexander admitted. "I almost married someone who turned out to be a professional criminal." "Ouch, that must have been devastating." "It was, but I learned something important about the difference between performance and authenticity. My friend's 8-year-old daughter was the one who figured out something was wrong. Emma's eyes lit up with interest. Children are remarkable lie detectors. In my experience, if kids don't like someone, there's usually a good reason. Alexander teased, "Don't count on it. You're marrying me for my mind, remember?" As they exchanged vows in front of the children's book section, Alexander thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. Victoria's deception had nearly cost him everything, but it had also taught him the difference between performance and authenticity, between manipulation and genuine love. Sophie had been right from the beginning. He deserved someone who loved him for real. And Emma Thompson, with her terrible cooking and brilliant mind and complete lack of interest in his money, loved him more genuinely than he'd ever thought possible. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Sophie cheered loudly enough to earn gentle shushing from the library patrons in the next room. Alexander and Emma's laughter echoed through the stacks, a sound of pure joy that marked the beginning of their happily ever after. Years later, when friends asked Alexander how he'd known Emma was different from Victoria, he would tell them about an 8-year-old girl who'd taught him to trust his instincts, and about a librarian who'd shown him that real love feels like coming home. "The difference," he would say, "is that real love doesn't ask you to change who you are or give up what matters to you. It celebrates the person you already are and helps you become even better." And if Sophie was around to hear the story, she would always add, "And real love keeps its promises, just like Uncle Alex promised he would find his real princess." Emma would laugh and correct her gently, "I'm not a princess, sweetheart. I'm just a librarian who fell in love with a very good man." "Same thing," Sophie would insist, and somehow that always felt exactly right. The headlines the next morning weren't just in New York. They stretched across continents. Billionaire groom exposes prenup plot at the altar. Tech titan's wedding turns into fraud scandal. And from I do to FBI, Hartwell's wedding collapse goes global. Victoria Sterling, or rather Victoria Chun, was now behind bars. Her accomplices had been processed, charged, and transported under high-security protocols. But for Alexander Hartwell, the silence after. The storm was almost deafening. The Waldorf ballroom, once a scene of elegance and deception, now stood empty. Leftover floral arrangements sat in buckets waiting for disposal. Photographs from the wedding were under federal evidence protection, and any hint of celebration had been scrubbed from the building's schedule. Alexander sat alone in his penthouse, staring out over the skyline, coffee cold in his hand. He had everything: wealth, freedom, vindication. But the victory felt hollow. Until a knock came at his door. He opened it to find Sophie standing there, holding a single daisy, wearing her backpack and a determined look. "You forgot something," she said. Alexander blinked. "What did I forget?" She handed him the flower. "That you still have people who care. And ice cream. We said we'd get ice cream." A slow smile crept across his face. "You're right. Ice cream is the one thing Victoria never tried to ruin." Sophie beamed. "Let's go, but I get to choose the flavor." Marcus appeared in the hallway behind her, dressed in casual clothes for the first time in weeks. "I thought a walk might do us all some good." They left the building quietly, unnoticed by the media still camped out in front. As they walked, Sophie swung their joined hands and asked the question that had been lingering unspoken. "Do you think you'll fall in love again, Uncle Alex?" Alexander paused, then looked down at her with a gentle smile. "I think I already am." Sophie wrinkled her nose. With who?" He laughed. "With life again, with the people who matter. With second chances." She seemed satisfied with that answer. "Okay, but if you do meet someone new, I want to meet her first." "Deal," he said. No one gets past Sophie Chun ever again. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the wedding that wasn't. Alexander had spent most of that time staying out of the public eye, taking long walks in Central Park with Marcus and Sophie, answering FBI calls and reflecting, not on what he'd lost, but what he'd nearly given away. One rainy afternoon, after walking Sophie to her friend's birthday party, he found himself wandering aimlessly in the West Village. The sharp scent of wet pavement and the glow of soft lamplight against old brick calmed something restless in him. That's when he saw her. She was sitting cross-legged behind the counter of a small independent bookstore, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, glasses sliding down her nose as she flipped through a hardcover. Her face was lit by a warm reading lamp, and despite the gloom outside, she looked at peace. Alexander almost walked past, but then she laughed quietly, genuinely, at something in her book. And that sound stopped him cold. He stepped inside. A bell chimed above the door. She looked up with a polite smile. "Hi there. Feel free to browse. If you're looking for anything specific, I'm happy to help." He hesitated. "I actually don't know what I'm looking for." She set the book aside. "That's the best kind of customer. Let me guess. Fiction with meaning, non-fiction with a little heart, or poetry you're afraid to admit you enjoy." Alexander raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his voice. "How'd you guess poetry? Your shoes say boardroom, but your eyes say Tess Eliot at midnight." He chuckled. "You're not wrong." She extended her hand. "Emma Thompson, book therapist, also known as the manager of this place. Alexander Hartwell." She blinked, recognition flitting across her face, but instead of reacting like most people did, with awe or awkward reverence, she just nodded. "You've had a rough month." That surprised him. "You know, let's just say I read more than books." He smiled again, genuinely this time. "Got anything for a man who narrowly avoided being conned into a billion-dollar wedding?" Emma walked over to a shelf, pulled out a slim novel, and handed it to him. "The Alchemist, for people rebuilding from the inside out. Not preachy, just good medicine." He took it. "Do I have to buy it, or is this the part where you hand me a life-changing quote and disappear into a puff of wisdom?" She grinned. "Well, if I did that, who'd run the register?" As Alexander left the store half an hour later, book in hand, heart strangely lighter, he looked back through the window. Emma had already returned to her reading. Calm, present, unimpressed by his wealth, interested only in whether he found the right story, and that, Alexander thought, might just be the beginning of one.